In mid-January 1804, newspapers began reporting that the ghost of a headless woman was terrifying sentries on the night watch around the outskirts of St. James's Park. This nightmarish figure would, it was said, appear suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, walk past them, and then vanish before their very eyes. So unnerving were her manifestations that several of the unfortunate soldiers who had witnessed them were, it was reported, hospitalized by the experience. In this video, I am going to recount the events surrounding the mysterious apparition's appearances, and using contemporary sources, uncover the full story of the headless woman of St. James's Park, whose nocturnal perambulations had, so the Morning Chronicle informed readers on Saturday the 14th of January, frightened several of the poor gods nearly to death. St. James's Park is the oldest of London's royal parks. The park layout that greets visitors today dates from the 1820s, when the Prince Regent, later George IV, commissioned John Nash to refashion the park. Its lush grass, towering trees and picturesque lake make for a delightful location at which to while away a summer's morning, afternoon or early evening. But come here on a winter's night, when the dark trees loom gaunt and imposing over the tussocks, casting weird shadows that dance and twist across the paths, and, well, let's just say it's not the sort of place you would wish to linger at for too long. The dark waters of the lake, so tranquil and lovely during the daylight hours, take on a dismal and foreboding air, and you find yourself constantly on edge, ever fearful that some malignant entity might be lurking in the murky depths, biding its time, awaiting the moment when it can come rushing to the surface to inflict who knows what horrors on those unfortunate enough to cross its path. In short, this is the perfect location for a haunting. However, the phenomena surrounding this particular ghostly tale are concerned with the previous incarnation of St. James's Park. In 1660, Charles II returned from exile, and the restoration of the monarchy was underway. Whilst abroad, Charles had been much impressed by the formal French gardens he had seen, and so shortly after his return to England, he ordered a complete renovation of St. James's Park, and the French landscaper André Mollet was commissioned to transform it into the type of ornamental affair that had so delighted the king on the continent. The centrepiece of Mollet's design was a tree-lined canal that was half a mile long, and since Charles had also opened the park to the public, his subjects came in their droves to stroll along the sides of the canal, whilst the king viewed it as the perfect place at which to rendezvous with his various mistresses. The canal was still a popular location for Londoners to disport themselves at when in January 1804 people began speaking of a headless spectre that was said to be haunting the soldiers based at the barracks close to it. In his book Ghosts of London, published in 1932, Elliott informs readers that
the matter was much talked about naturally by the soldiers in the guardroom, and sentries went to their various posts in the park, shivering and shaking. The weather seemingly mattered not. The headless phantom came on fine nights when the park was bathed in moonlight, and the great silent trees stood out even more clearly than in the daytime, and it came on dark, stormy nights when the wind blew and howled among the trees, and the rain fell in sheer torrents. Heat and cold, too, had no effect on it. Its nightly appearance could be counted on. A soldier pacing to and fro, apprehensively watching the black shadows of the solemn oaks and elms, would suddenly see a figure emerge from behind some tree and glide noiselessly towards him. He did not challenge it. He shut his eyes and kept them shut till it had passed. Why? Because it was headless.
If Elliott is to be believed, we have here a real creeper of a ghostly tale, and one that is more than worthy of investigation. So come with me as we part the mists of time and travel through the shadows to arrive in St. James's Park as the year 1804 is ushered in with fierce storms that howl through the streets of London, toppling chimneys, unroofing houses, and capsizing shipping on the River Thames. And thus it is that this spooky tale can actually begin with the immortal words, "It was a dark and stormy night." In St. James's Park itself, the gaunt trees that lined the canal bent and bowed, groaning against the ceaseless onslaught, some of their branches being ripped off by the ferocious gusts and sent crashing onto the grass or hurled into the tempest-tossed waters below. Around the park, the wind and the rain battered and rattled the windows and doors of the royal palaces as their residents snuggled deep beneath the blankets, giving thanks that they didn't have to be outside on nights such as these. But for the soldiers whose sworn duty it was to protect the palace quarter, there was no choice but to brave the elements, and so they took up their posts, no doubt fortified by a tot or two from their rum rations, and readied themselves to spend an uncomfortable night being rain-lashed and wind-whipped. As some of them stood stoically at their posts, squinting through the January storms, they noticed an indistinct form emerging from the darkness, and they watched nervously as it drifted towards them. Preparing to challenge this mysterious visitant, their jaws dropped wide as they saw to their horror that it was in fact the spectre of a headless woman, and their courage deserted them as they turned about and raced hell for leather for the safety of the guardroom. Soon people were whispering in hushed tones that something or someone was making night hideous for the sentries around St. James's Park, and it wasn't long before word of the Revenant's nocturnal roamings had reached the press. Sensing a good story, fearless reporters were dispatched to glean whatever information they could about the headless phantom, with whom the soldiers had apparently been coming face to face, or, to be more precise, face to shoulders. Several newspapers broke the story of the ghost in their editions of Friday the 13th of January, among them the Evening Mail.
This nightly wanderer has chosen St. James's Park for a place of rendezvous, where it has been regularly seen by the soldiers on guard for upwards of a week past, between the hours of 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. A few nights ago, it was observed at a late hour by one of the Coldstream Regiment whilst on duty near the Royal Cockpit. The poor fellow is ready to swear he saw pass by him a woman without a head. The more he reflected, the more terrified he became, as he knew all the park gates had been fastened for some hours, and therefore he could not suppose it to be someone who had got into the park for the purpose of frightening him. The soldier is sure it was not a person dressed up in a white sheet, because he could plainly discern the arms, and, notwithstanding his great alarm, he observed that the shoulders of the ghost were the highest part of it. He therefore concluded, whatever it might be, that it had got no head. This man was considered as one of the most resolute men in the regiment. He was, however, taken ill immediately on his leaving guard, and the next day sent to the hospital, where he still remains. On Tuesday, one of his comrades, having heard of the affair, and having to take the same watch that night, was resolved to look out for the ghost and to speak to it. Accordingly, at the usual time, her ghost ship paid him a visit. She appeared again without a head, and entered the park from the end of Queen Street near to the Royal Cockpit. This veteran, who had often braved a cannonball, was now panic-struck at a shadow. He described himself to have got a locked jaw, and when he wanted to cry, "Who comes there?" he could not utter a word. Although he was tongue-tied, it does not appear, however, he was leg-tied, for on the ghost seeming inclined to be better acquainted with him, he quitted his post and ran with all possible speed to the guardroom, where he had scarce recited the dismal story to the sergeant before he fell into strong fits, and continued so ill afterwards that he was taken to the hospital on Wednesday, where he is now confined to his bed. Another night this headless ghost held its midnight revels in an empty house behind the armoury room, and amused for some time in opening and shutting the windows. But what is most remarkable of all, the apparition called out as lustily for a light as if it had got a boatswain's head upon its shoulders. Having finished its pranks in the empty dwelling, the soldier, who was a witness to this novel scene, observed this dreadful spectre to pass by him at the distance of 50 yards, and walked over the park paling as easy as he could step over a straw. It then proceeded towards the canal and vanished from his sight. There are several other stories current amongst the Coldstream Regiment respecting the nocturnal gambols of this ghost, and it is said that several soldiers, besides those already mentioned, have seen, whilst on duty, what they suppose a supernatural phantom, which has so affected them that they were taken ill immediately and sent to the hospital. But be that as it may, it is an undoubted fact that 2 sentinels have been sent there from the effects of fright, whatever may have been the real cause of it.
The Morning Chronicle that same day reported a far more dramatic climax to the haunting.
The ghost, it seems, appeared last week to some of the privates of the Coldstream Regiment, dressed in white, and on being challenged with "Who goes there?" the ghost shrieked violently and instantly disappeared. The soldier, as report goes, quitted his post and ran to the guardhouse, where, after relating what he had seen to the sergeant, he fell down in a fit and in that condition was taken to an hospital. It is added that he died on Saturday last in consequence of the fright and was buried on Tuesday. The ghost, very prudently, has not since made its appearance.
Terrifying indeed, but a story that appears to have been little more than a press fabrication, a phantom in its own right, as there are no official records of the ghost having been responsible for scaring a soldier to death, and there were no press reports of any inquest, which in the case of a mysterious and sudden death such as this would undoubtedly have been held. Something very untoward, though, was evidently going on in the vicinity of St. James's Park, and according to the Daily Advertiser and Oracle, at least one investigator had shown himself determined to find out exactly what that something was.
The story of an uncouth figure in St. James's Park in the dead of night has occasioned much conversation amongst the guards for some time past, and so generally was the fact believed that at a late hour on Saturday night a clergyman entered the birdcage walk and patrolled it for several hours in the hope that he might meet the figure when he trusted he should detect some person who through wantonness was endeavouring to alarm the neighbourhood. The whole night, however, passed away without his being able to make any discovery.
The paper went on to report that
the last time it is said that this phantom was seen was upwards of a week ago, when it was observed about 1 o'clock in the morning to walk with solemn gait from the cockpit door to the canal, but whether it afterwards vanished in the air or sunk into the water, the informant cannot say.
Some of the locals, the paper revealed, had even come up with a possible identity for the roving wraith.
It was not until the other day that the old women about the park were able to account for the ghost's appearance, and they now recollect that about 16 years ago a sergeant murdered his wife in the park by cutting off her head, and they therefore attributed the phantom's appearance to that circumstance.
Again, this rumour appears to have had little basis in fact, as there are no records of any such murder having occurred in the 1780s, or at any time in the last 50 years of the 18th century for that matter, so this may have been a simple case of local gossips trying to elicit recompense from reporters for having provided them with an explanation for the ghostly goings-on, or, perish the thought, of journalists simply inventing a possible explanation for the haunting. Army officials had to this point given the tales of the ghostly appearances short shrift. But as it was now becoming apparent that the rumours of it were starting to affect morale amongst the ranks, it was decided that an investigation should be undertaken, and accordingly the adjutant of the Coldstream Regiment made his way to the orderly room of the Horse Guards and sent for George Jones of the 16th Company for the purpose, so the Oracle and Daily Advertiser continued, of interrogating him about the ghost, as it was said that he was one of the men who had seen it and had been considerably affected by the sight. When questioned, he was adamant that his encounter with the spectral figure was genuine, and so on January the 15th he was taken to the public office at Bow Street, where he appeared before the Chief Magistrate for London, Sir Richard Ford. The Chief Clerk to the court, Mr. Stafford, proceeded to interrogate Jones to establish whether he had actually seen the ghost or whether the manifestation might be a figment of his imagination. I should point out that at this time the Hammersmith ghost was very much in the news on account of 29-year-old Francis Smith having shot dead Thomas Millwood, whom he had mistaken for the ghost. I've made a full video about the Hammersmith ghost and I'll put a link to it in the description down below. Stafford therefore asked George Jones if he was familiar with accounts of the Hammersmith ghost in the newspapers, or whether he had read any other dismal story about the supernatural that might have dwelt on his mind and misled his fancies. Jones was emphatic that he had no knowledge of the Hammersmith ghost, nor for that matter, of any other ghostly tales. On being quizzed about the figure he had encountered, Jones stated that he firmly believed that he had seen a ghost. With that, Sir Richard Ford asked him to swear an oath to that effect. The Sun published his sworn account of the topless ghost on page 3 of its edition of Monday the 16th of January.
I do hereby solemnly declare that whilst on guard at the Recruit House on or about the 3rd instant, about 1:30 in the morning, I perceived the figure of a woman without a head rise from the earth at a distance of about 3 feet before me. I was so alarmed at the circumstance that I had not power to speak to it, which was my wish to have done. But I distinctly observed that the figure was dressed in a red striped gown with red spots between each stripe, and that part of the dress and figure appeared to me enveloped in a cloud. In about the space of 2 seconds, whilst my eyes were fixed on the object, it vanished from sight. I was perfectly sober and collected at the time, and being in a great trepidation, called to the next sentinel, who met me about halfway, and to whom I communicated the strange sight I had seen. Signed, George Jones of Lieutenant Colonel Taylor's Company of Coldstream Guards, Westminster, January the 15th, 1804.
On the same day, a second soldier also swore an affidavit regarding his experience of having seen the ghost.
I do hereby declare that whilst on guard behind the Armoury House, to the best of my recollection about 3 weeks ago, I heard at 12 o'clock at night a tremendous noise which proceeded from the window of an uninhabited house near the spot where I was upon duty. At the same time I heard a voice cry out, "Bring me a light! Bring me a light!" The last sentence was uttered in so feeble and changeable a tone of voice that I concluded some person was ill, and consequently offered them my assistance to procure a light. I could, however, obtain no answer to my proposal, although I repeated it several times, and as often heard the voice use the same terms. I endeavoured to see the person who called out, but in vain. On a sudden, the violent noise was renewed, which appeared to resemble sashes of windows lifted hastily up and down, but then they moved in such quick succession, and at different parts of the house nearly at the same time, that it seemed impossible to me that one person could accomplish the whole business. I heard several of the regiment say they have heard similar noises and proceedings, but have never heard the cause accounted for. Richard Donkin, 12th Company of Coldstream Guards, Whitehall, January the 15th, 1804.
However, by this time, newspapers such as the True Briton were plainly losing patience with the story.
The 2 soldiers who have declared that they saw the ghost of a woman without a head have plainly shown that others are in want of a head.
The Salisbury and Winchester Journal, on Monday the 23rd of January, suggested that the ghostly figure was in fact the result of the boys from a local school having acquired a phantasmagoria, a magic lantern-type device which had been developed in France in the 18th century and which had been demonstrated in London at the Lyceum Theatre in 1801, where the ghosts, demons and other optical illusions it was able to conjure up had become a smash hit.
It is said that some of the young gentlemen of Westminster School have purchased a capital phantasmagoric apparatus, which, guided by the story of the murdered woman, they have a headless figure in a female dress, and have succeeded in throwing the shade on the gravel walk, and in making it afterwards appear to rise and glide towards the palisades of the canal, which it stalks over and vanishes near the water. They have also thrown figures on the windows and walls of the uninhabited house, part of the supposed noises in which have probably been occasioned by the blusterous weather and magnified by superstition, though, if this statement be correct, it is not too much to suppose that the scholars would complete their ingenious mischief by finding means to introduce one of their party into the house. Certain it is that men who would march unappalled to the mouth of a loaded cannon have been frightened by this story, and have contrived every means to avoid the guard where this goblin has sported its gambols.
And thereafter the story of the headless woman of St. James's Park faded from the newspapers, albeit, according to Elliott in his Ghosts of London in 1932, her spectral figure was still alleged to manifest itself periodically. Who or what she was never established. It is possible that the fact that the Hammersmith ghost hauntings had ended in tragedy with the shooting dead of Thomas Millwood, a crime for which Francis Smith was being tried at the Old Bailey, had caused the person, or persons, behind the hauntings to cease and desist. It is a reasonable assumption that the whole affair was, as several newspapers had suggested, a prank perpetrated by the pupils of Westminster School, who had somehow gotten hold of a phantasmagoria device which they were using to chilling effect to cast ghostly images on the walls of the unoccupied houses near to which the soldiers were reported to have seen the fearsome phantom. Of course, there is always the possibility that there was a kernel of truth in the rumour that a sergeant had murdered his wife some years before, and that the apparition was therefore her ghost seeking to be reunited with her missing head. Elliott O'Donnell ends his account of the haunting with the tantalising claim that
the finding in 1795 during digging operations on the parade of a skeleton, sex not determined, but thought to be that of a woman, gave rise to speculations regarding other sounds and sights believed to be ghostly.
I have to say that I can find no record of such a find being made in the neighbourhood of the park in 1795, nor for that matter at any stage in the late 18th or early 19th century. I suppose, though, anything is possible, for, as Shakespeare once pointed out to me, there are more things in heaven and earth, Richard, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Sage words indeed, Bill. Sage words indeed. Do you believe this was a genuine haunting, or do you think it was another prank of a type that became increasingly popular throughout the country in the first half of the 19th century? Let me know in the comments section below. I hope you've enjoyed this ghostly little tale. If you have, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And should you happen to find yourself in St. James's Park, where night has draped a cloak of sinister shadow over it, be sure to make your way to the bridge that crosses the lake and let your gaze fall across its dark waters. If perchance they should start to ripple, and an indistinct figure should begin to rise, surface-bound from its inky depths, will you be brave enough to stand your ground and confront the fearsome spectre of the Headless Lady? Or will you, like those long-ago sentries, turn heel and hurry away for the safety of the nearby well-lit streets? I know what I would do. Till we meet again in the twilight world of the paranormal, dear viewer, stay safe, and when you get to bed tonight, do have very sweet and pleasant dreams.